If you study the architectural landscape of the Naruto universe, a distinct pattern begins to emerge. Most of the hidden villages are relatively low-rise settlements that spread horizontally across the natural landscape. Konoha grows through the forest, Suna spreads through the desert, and Iwagakure is integrated into the mountains. Even though their architectural identities are very different, they generally maintain a familiar relationship between the building and the ground it sits on. And then, there is Amegakure. The Hidden Rain Village is a terrifying anomaly. Instead of spreading peacefully across the landscape, it rises vertically into a dense forest of concrete towers, industrial structures, elevated walkways, exposed pipes, and enormous drainage systems. It looks less like a feudal shinobi settlement, and more like something taken straight out of a cyberpunk dystopia. But what makes Amegakure so interesting is that its strange appearance may actually be the logical result of the environment and history surrounding it. Because Amegakure has two enormous problems, its geography and its rain. And once you understand those two things, its architecture starts to make a lot more sense. Hi, my name is Benaya, and this is Paralark. Our goal is to redefine how people view fictional spaces through a professional architectural and urban planning perspective. From games, anime, manga, and films to novels and everything in between, we explore how fictional worlds are actually built. If you enjoy this type of content, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. And without any further ado, this is how war shaped the Hidden Rain Village. To understand why Amegakure or Hidden Rain Village looks the way it does, we first have to look where it is located. The Hidden Rain Village sits within an unnamed country, positioned between major powers such as the lands of fire, wind, and earth. Amegakure is effectively a buffer state, too small to dictate the actions of its neighbors, but strategically important enough that it cannot simply be ignored. When the great nations go to war, Amegakure is the kind of place that gets caught in the middle. Its territory becomes a route for armies, its land becomes a battlefield, and its population is forced to endure conflicts that were never really theirs to begin with. For a city in that position, land is not an unlimited resource. Expanding outward means creating a larger and more exposed urban footprint. Every additional road, neighborhood, and piece of infrastructure becomes another area that can potentially be attacked or occupied. In a more secure nation, horizontal expansion may simply be the natural result of population growth. In Amegakure, however, sprawling across the landscape would mean making the settlement increasingly difficult to protect. So the city goes in the opposite direction. It builds upward. This is perhaps the most obvious architectural difference between Amegakure and the other major villages. Rather than spreading across the landscape, Amegakure is compressed into an incredibly dense vertical cityscape. Towers dominate the skyline, and elevated walkways connect different structures and levels throughout the settlement. Vertical development allows the city to increase its population and infrastructure without continuously expanding its horizontal footprint. In other words, Amegakure does not necessarily need more land. It needs more urban capacity without exposing more territory. And this gives the city a very different character from somewhere like Konoha. Konoha feels like a settlement that grew outward as its population increased. Amegakure feels like a settlement that was compressed by its circumstances. Its verticality does not just make it visually distinctive, it communicates the constraints under which the city developed. And that decision becomes even more important when we introduce Amegakure's other defining condition, the rain. The constant rainfall in Amegakure is so visually prominent that it is easy to treat it as nothing more than atmosphere. It makes the village look gloomy, reinforces its identity, and creates the dramatic backdrop that defines many of its most memorable scenes. In fact, under Pain's rule, this rain is not just weather at all. It is a form of ninjutsu used for surveillance, allowing him to detect and monitor anyone who enters the village. But architecturally, the rain is much more significant than that. Rainwater has to go somewhere, and the heavier the rainfall, the more important that process becomes. Buildings need to shed water from their roofs, streets need to transport runoff, and drainage systems need to handle massive, continuous volumes of water. A large building with a broad roof is essentially collecting a giant volume of rainwater every time a storm passes over it. Without adequate drainage, that water does not just disappear, it accumulates, overwhelms surfaces, seeps into structures, and creates long-term structural damage. So drainage cannot simply be an afterthought. It becomes essential infrastructure. And in Amegakure, where rainfall is a routine, that infrastructure can't be hidden due to its required size for the amount of water it manages, in the form of those giant pipes. And this is where Amegakure's design starts to connect to something very real in architectural history. Because the idea of exposing pipes, ducts, and structural systems is not unique to fiction. In fact, it has a very clear precedent in a movement known as structural expressionism. Structural expressionism is an architectural approach where a building's functional systems, its structure, its mechanical services, its circulation, are not concealed behind decorative facades, but instead are deliberately revealed and emphasized. Rather than hiding how a building works, the architecture shows how it works. And one of the most famous real-world examples of this philosophy is the Centre Pompidou in Paris, designed by Renzo Piano, Richard Rogers, and Gianfranco Francini. At first glance, the Centre Pompidou looks almost inverted. Instead of a clean exterior hiding its systems, everything is pushed outward. The structural frame is exposed, the circulation system is visible. And most importantly for this discussion, the building's mechanical services, its pipes, ducts, and ventilation systems, are placed on the outside of the building rather than hidden inside. Color-coded pipes run along the facade, clearly distinguishing their function. What would normally be concealed within walls becomes part of the building's identity. The architecture is no longer just a finished surface, it is a readable system. And this is where the connection to Amegakure becomes especially interesting. Because while Amegakure skyscrapers are obviously not a real-world structural expressionism building, its visual language unintentionally echoes the same principle. The exposed pipes are not just aesthetic world building, they resemble a city where infrastructure has become so important and so unavoidable that it can no longer be hidden. In both cases, the logic is similar. When a system is essential enough to the functioning of a structure, it begins to define how that structure looks. At the Centre Pompidou, that system is modern building services in a dense urban cultural hub. In Amegakure, that system is water management in an environment of relentless rainfall. And in both, the result is the same architectural idea made visible. The building is not just a form, it is a functioning machine. But perhaps one of the strangest things about Amegakure is how little emphasis it places on the traditional ground level. In most cities, the street is the primary organizing element. Buildings meet the ground, people circulate along streets, businesses operate at street level, and much of everyday urban life is concentrated around that horizontal plane. But Amegakure feels different. Its architecture is layered. Walkways cross between buildings. Elevated structures connect different parts of the city. Towers rise from a landscape that seems increasingly secondary to the urban fabric built above it. This vertical stratification is not just spatial, but hierarchical as well. The higher you go, the more functional and structurally integrated the city becomes, while the lower levels tend to reflect neglect, decay, and reduced living conditions. Just like how Ryusui explained to Yudachi before discovering Jiraya's hidden bar, on lower ground level where it wasn't supposed to be. And this becomes especially interesting when we consider Amegakure's relationship with water. The village is surrounded by significant bodies of water, and the environment is visually dominated by both standing water and constant rainfall. As a result, the boundary between the city and the water becomes an important part of its identity. There are real-world cities where water has fundamentally changed the relationship between architecture and the ground, with Venice being one of the most famous examples. Venice was built across a collection of islands within a lagoon, and water is not simply something that exists beside the city. It is integrated into the way the city functions. Transportation, circulation, and urban form all developed around the fact that the conventional street network could not operate in the same way it does on solid ground. Amegakure takes a very different approach. But the comparison is useful because it highlights the same underlying architectural question. What happens when water becomes impossible to ignore? Instead of adapting the city primarily to the water at ground level, Amegakure seems to increasingly move life above it. The result is a city where the ground begins to lose its dominance. Buildings become stacked, circulation becomes elevated, and the urban experience becomes increasingly vertical. There is also a subtle defensive advantage to building so much of the city above and around bodies of water. Even in a world of ninjas where mobility is already highly advanced, water still introduces a natural layer of complexity to combat. It restricts movement, disrupts footing, and forces engagements into more predictable paths like bridges, platforms, and narrow elevated routes. In that sense, surrounding or integrating the city with water doesn't make it invulnerable, but it does make large-scale attacks more difficult to execute cleanly, since any conflict is naturally funneled into constrained and controllable spaces, unlike how pain easily turned Konoha into a battleground. And perhaps that is why its story feels so human. Because in the end, Amegakure is not only built from concrete and steel, but from absence. From the children who never had a home that was not already breaking. Orphans of a world where war never truly stopped at the borders. Where even childhood had to be raised in the shadow of collapsing cities and falling rain. Their lives, like the village itself, were shaped by forces too large to resist, pushed upward by violence, compressed by loss, and forced to find meaning in the narrow spaces left behind. Amegakure is not a city that survived the war. It is a city that remembers it in every pipe, every tower, every drop of rain that never seems to end.
Hi, thank you for watching Paralark. Feel free to leave a comment suggesting any fictional building, city, or architectural concept from your favorite games, anime, or even movies for us to analyze next. Until then, stay alive and drink coffee.